welcome. This evening we will celebrate Professor Rossi, Benedetta, as a wonderful scholar. We will be able to do this also through the specific structure of the evening, with an introduction delivered by another wonderful scholar, and if I may, fellow medievalist, Professor Paulo Fernando de Moraes Farias from the University of Birmingham, who will introduce formally Benedetta's lecture. Inaugural lectures are very important occasions in the life of a university department. They are obviously very important for the person delivering the lecture, which marks a pivotal moment in their career, one that is at the same time highly symbolic and very real. They are important for the department as a community because we celebrate the success of one of us. We also welcome colleagues from outside, we welcome our colleagues' former mentors, we welcome their family and friends. The occasion is important for them as well. Former mentors, I'm sure, see their former intuition confirmed. Family and friends share the joy and pride. The occasion is also important for those who introduce the lecture and comment on it, because they have the chance to enjoy retracing their colleagues' and friends' intellectual journey. They have the chance to find the dots and join them. But because they address audiences beyond the usual circle of academic friends and colleagues, inaugural lectures are also important for all of us, because they are a powerful reminder that the role that academics, and especially, may I say, historians play in the world, is not simply defined by their contribution to the advancement of their discipline, but their conferences and research projects, by their articles and books, all those things that shine under the bright lights of ref success and academic prizes. Their role is also deeply rooted in their activities as members of a community. So just while we are preparing to celebrate Benedetta, Professor Rossi, as a wonderful scholar, I would like to emphasize what we could call the non-academic, dare I say political importance of her scholarship. To reflect on ideas and practices of exploitation, and to ask questions about how different members of different social groups understood and conceptualize exploitation, is to intercept issues that are fundamental for each of us and for the politics of our daily activities. I might be slightly overinterpreting things, but I am convinced that this side of Benedetta's work has deep roots. Benedetta went to one of the two best secondary schools in Rome, the Liceo Classico Visconti, that adorns the north side of Piazza del Collegio Romano, right in the middle of the Centro Storico. I can say that her former school is one of the two best because I went to the other best one, the Liceo Classico Tasso, that also sits downtown, majestically dominating the area right on top of Via Veneto. In other words, Benedetta is the Benedetta, not me, Benedetta is the product of the best tradition of Italian secondary education. And still today, these state-run, comprehensive schools are places of incredibly intense political debate, as well as of study. Places where teenagers really learn at first hand how relevant politics are for our daily lives, how important social and historical sciences are for our understanding of those politics. In fact, Benedetta's work, from her research on politics, labor, and ecology in the Nigerian Sahel, to her comparative analysis of Le Monde de l'Esclavage, to her current research project on African abolitionism, is a powerful reminder of the impact that historians can have on the way in which national and international groups shape their discourses on key areas of policy, such as citizenship, gender equality, human rights, inclusion, and so on. So from me, and on behalf of all the department, thank you, Professor Rossi, and well done. And it is now a real pleasure and an honor for me to welcome Professor Paulo Fernando de Moraes Farias from the University of Birmingham and ask him to introduce formally Professor Benedetta Rossi's inaugural lecture. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, It is a very pleasurable task to introduce the inaugural lecture of Professor Benedetta Rossi, but a task that involves a certain risk. Benedetta is in the business of paradigm change, and it is quite likely that as soon as I finish this short introduction and she begins to speak, she will demonstrate that she is already decades ahead of what I have just presented as her current stage of thinking. But I take the risk with great delight. She is a thinker. That is one of the fundamental saliences in her career that I would like to point out. She is able to create concepts, and we owe her the luminous concept of kinetocracy, which captures the way power is exercised or was exercised in societies in the Sahel, where given the local ecology, to have power meant to be able to control one's own movements and the movements of other people. It was mobility. What was the result of that? It meant that the nomadic political elite that dominated the region, we are speaking about the Sahel, we are speaking about Professor Rossi's monograph, From Slavery to Aid, Politics, Labor, and Ecology in the Nigerian Sahel, from 1800 to 2000. In that region, the power of the nomadic political elite depended not on the accumulation of material wealth, but actually, on the contrary, on the capacity to remain, to avoid excessive possessions, to remain unencumbered by possessions. But that is not all. The analysis that Benedetta conducts in this book of this question of mobility also leads to matters of genre and ecology. The ecology is obviously present, the desert ambience, the Sahelian ambience. But Benedetta demonstrates that the ability to move was affected not only by status and ethnicity, but also by gender. And this theme of gender is continued on the several articles Professor Rossi contributed to a more recent book, Le Monde de l'Esclavage, published in 2021 in Paris by Edition UCL. All this Professor Rossi follows with these research avenues she opens up. She follows this with a truly interdisciplinary approach, which very firmly combines history and ethnography. The book I have just mentioned, From Slavery to Aid, chapter after chapter, again and again, demonstrates that awareness of deep history is a powerful, indispensable tool of developmental strategies. And the book is based both on meticulous work on colonial written records and on a wealth of oral material collected by Benedetta in her field work. So this strong interdisciplinarity is another aspect of her work I would like to emphasize. She pays detailed attention to the historical agency exercised by Africans. This leaves her to take a very critical view of accounts that have suggested that European abolitionism was solely responsible for the legal abolition of slavery in Africa. Her recent work shows very clearly that this was not what actually happened. And one most interesting facet of this work that she has been doing lately is the re-examination of the actually rather complex biographies of figures that had been commonly listed simply as enslavers or abolitionists. The contradictions, apparent or real, that appear in the career of these figures, protagonists, each in their own way, or also of the process of abolition, is another very interesting, fascinating side of what she has been doing. Now, Professor Rossi's work and personality have been and continue to be a point of attraction and convergence that helps to develop great collective scholarly projects across national and continental borders. And this is, I also think, a very significant aspect of her contribution to scholarship. So this is where I stop, and let us now, all of us, join together in the pleasure of listening to Professor Benedetta Rossi herself.
Good evening to all of you, and thank you, Antonio, thank you, Paulo, for your very generous introductions. It is a real honor for me to give this lecture here at UCL and share with you some of the recent developments of my work. Before I start, I would like to thank many colleagues and collaborators with whom I have been working on topics connected to this lecture for many years, for about 10 years now. As academics, we spend a lot of time working on our own, but in the past 10 years, I have been involved as coordinator and as researcher in large collaborative research projects. Most recently, AFRAB, African Abolitionism, funded by the European Research Council. This is a photo taken very recently at the University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. LESLAN, the Legacies of Slavery in Niger, funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council. L'Archive, another ERC grant where I have joined Camille Lefebvre and Arya Wagana in the photo researching Kanuri and Hausa sources for Hausa and Central Sahelian history, but also collective publication projects such as Le Monde de l'Esclavage that has been mentioned already, or the enslavement project, which preceded the other projects and created new contacts with colleagues who have continued working together. And the CART project, coordinated by Professor Ibrahim Atioub at the University of Dakar, where I had the privilege of teaching these postgraduate students about 7 years ago. And then the CHIBO and the XU projects funded by the ERC and by Canadian funding. The Coast European Network on Worlds of Related Coercions in Work. This is a coast action. I have had the privilege and pleasure to work closely with many African artists. This is the painter who painted the image that is on the cover of my lecture's slides, musicians and photographers. And I have had the pleasure of working closely with some of the leading anti-slavery activists who are struggling to put an end to slavery in Africa today. So I am very grateful for these collaborations. And my lecture today draws from a dialogue that has been ongoing and that is continuing, from working together, from sharing ideas, from collecting sources and analyzing them and thinking about them together. And if I had to mention everybody by name, it would take the whole hour, but here they are, and these have been incredibly important networks that shape who we are as academics. Today, this is very much about celebrating these international collaborations, primarily with African colleagues. I also have to thank the donors who have made all of this possible, and particularly the European Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council of the UK. But let me get to the point. Now, abolitionism has been a major ideological revolution that turned slavery from a legitimate institution to an aberration worldwide. Its development has been studied unevenly for different world regions. It has been studied extensively in Europe and the Americas. By contrast, within African history, the evolution of anti-slavery has largely been treated as background, not a process that African free and enslaved persons were actively engaged in, but one introduced or imposed from the outside. This is a problem. We know little about how, where, and when the meanings and moral connotations of slavery were transformed by African actors in African societies. Studying the history of slavery in Africa in the age of abolition is not only about understanding how African societies adapted to the end of foreign demand in enslaved Africans. There may or may not have been a so-called crisis of adaptation in African economies and societies following the end of the Atlantic slave trade. And these are questions that have been debated extensively by economic historians working on specific regions, localities, and periods. But addressing these questions, important as it is not the same as analyzing how moral perceptions of slavery started changing among specific African groups and individuals who mobilized to turn slaving, slave trading, and slaveholding into crimes. A large amount of research will be needed to clarify precisely when and how these processes happened in all parts of the African continent, who were the main ideologues of anti-slavery, and what strategies they unfolded. But the research that I have been able to carry out so far, much of it in collaboration with international and primarily African colleagues, shows that throughout the 19th and 20th century, people in Africa progressively reimagined the meaning of slavery and the slave trade. The relations that slavery made possible changed accordingly. In all this, two intertwined processes of change seem to have always been present, a bottom-up one and a top-down one. First, the bottom-up one. Africans who had experienced slavery directly played a major role in the history that I wish to discuss here. Some of them overcame traumatic experiences and became drivers of change in a process that I imagine as multiple localized rhizomatic anti-slavery movements that started quiet ideological revolutions at the grassroots of African societies. Concurrently, Since the 19th century, the slave trade and slavery have been undergoing a constant process of legal abolition and criminalization, which has not ended to this day. This has been a top-down process involving rulers, legal specialists, and elite political and intellectual actors. Another important consideration, a major element of variation is the extent to which in any one location and at any one time, these two processes were either relatively localized or were integrated in transnational abolitionist movements and campaigns. And another important consideration is that grassroots activists who came from slavery, from the liberated Africans of the 19th century to the victims turned activists of today, have been, on the whole, marginal actors in their societies and institutions. They lived in societies dominated by local freeborn elites and had limited access to productive and social capital, primarily farmland and freeborn wives. In the 19th century, because of their histories of emancipation, liberated Africans were often integrated in institutions such as missions, schools, or military institutions run by Europeans. Even within these institutions, they were marginalized. In the second half of the 19th century, these institutions became progressively more imperialist and more racist. In African societies and in colonial institutions, those who held positions of power had little interest in promoting the full emancipation of the formerly enslaved. Those of the latter who had firm abolitionist views had to struggle, not only against people who defended slavery, but also against those who posed as liberators. Already in 1970, Walter Rodney made clear in his History of the Upper Guinea Coast, 1545-1800, that these struggles were always political. Africa or Europe, and indeed Britain, France, the Sokoto Caliphate, the Sultanate of Zanzibar, the Kingdom of Dahomey, the Kingdom of Buganda, the Tamashek-speaking Toshits spread across the Sahara and Sahel. Yoruba, Igbo, Lango, and Acholi societies do not have a unified historical agency. When we say Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, what we actually refer to is the end result of struggles between persons and groups with different views, interests, and aspirations. Similar struggles happened in each African society and locality. Slavery is one of power's most brutal manifestations. And in the words of Frederick Douglass, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. In what follows, I'd like to examine some of the ways in which power was confronted with a growing demand that those considered legitimately enslavable be reimagined as humans, that the enslaved be treated as citizens of a community, a religion, a kingdom, a state, that they be treated as potential kin. 1 hour is very short time to consider these processes on a continental scale, but I shall attempt to give glimpses into how this demand was articulated, by whom, and with what consequences over about 2 centuries. So since the mid-18th century, anti-slave trade arguments were promoted in Africa and the world by Africans who had experienced enslavement. Those amongst them who were based outside Africa impacted global abolitionism, and their ideas are better known than those of their African-based counterparts. Intellectuals in the African diasporas, people like Philip Kwakwe, James Gronyasau, Phyllis Wheatley, Kwab Makugwano, Gustavus Vassa, also known as Olaudah Equiano, played a fundamental role in the development of global abolitionism. The testimonies of survivors have always been a critical aspect of global and local activism. More than any other group, they could muster empathy. This was true in Africa as elsewhere in the world. However, as Chima Korie and Femi Kolapo have argued, the history of global African diasporas originating from the slave trade is better studied than the history of the diasporas of formerly enslaved Africans within the African continent, to which I shall now turn. Some Africans who had experienced enslavement became instrumental to the spread of anti-slavery ideas in African societies. They spoke up to convince people who defended slavery that slavery was indefensible. For example, several participants in the 1841 British expedition to the River Niger wrote accounts of the signing of treaties of friendship and trade that included clauses by which local rulers committed themselves to passing edicts against the slave trade. Amongst those who participated in the expedition were liberated Africans Samuel Ajayi Crowther and Simon Jonas, the Igbo interpreter. When the ruler of Abo mentioned that it would be difficult for him to give up the slave trade, Simon Jonas gave a long speech to convince the Obi that he ought to find it harder to keep it than to give it up. After describing his own personal experience, he highlighted the state of continued insecurity that the slave trade entailed for the Igbo country and how this impacted on society as a whole. Samuel Crowther, also a liberated African, who became the first Anglican bishop in West Africa, advocated abolition in Europe and Africa in the course of the same expedition. Enslaved in 1821 at 13, Crowther was captured while he was having a meal with his family in a village of the Yoruba region of Nigeria. He was bought and sold 6 times before being forced to board a Portuguese ship, the Esperança Felix, near Lagos. The ship was intercepted the following day. Liberated in Sierra Leone, Samuel Crowther converted to Christianity and was one of the first 4 graduates of Fura Bay College in Freetown. He was recruited to join the Niger expedition in 1841. During the expedition, he was committed to evangelization and anti-slavery. He pronounced himself in public at a slave market against the slave trade. And I quote, "What feelings must have been produced in our hearts by the sight of our fellow creatures exposed like cattle for sale can easily be perceived. But the expedience of making them known at the place and in presence of the slaves might perhaps be questioned. Expediency, however, was not the rule which guided me. But from a sense of duty, I expressed my feelings to all who were present. I informed them that the chief design of our expedition was to put an end to the trade in human flesh and blood, and expatiated on the sinfulness of the practice, it being against the laws of God and the laws of the most enlightened kingdoms of the world, and productive of innumerable evils amongst themselves." Crowther was made Anglican priest in England in 1843 and consecrated as bishop in 1864. When he returned to Sierra Leone, he preached both in English and Yoruba. Sent to Abeokuta with German missionary Karl Anders Goldmer and other African and European missionaries, he preached to hundreds and was the leader and mentor of many local missionaries. In spite of this, he was faced with racism and distrust in his leadership among white members of the Church Missionary Society. This led to a crisis, and some of Crowther's closest collaborators developed anti-racist and anti-colonial critiques and strategies. One of the best known among them was James Holly Johnson, whose career and thoughts have been studied in Emmanuel Ayandele's biography of 1970. But this is not just a West African story. In East Africa, Reverend William Jones, a liberated African trained in India, became a teacher and leader of the Rabbi Church Missionary Society community and took what at the time was considered a radical stance in favor of former slaves who appealed for his help. Rabbi counted 1,200 ex-slaves, including about 900 former runaways, mainly from the Arab Swahili coast. Reverend William Jones imposed strict rules that had to be followed in exchange for protection. Not far from Rabbi, at the United Methodist Free Churches mission in Ribe, Reverends During and Hero were 2 Sierra Leonean ministers who also accepted fugitives. Between 1884 and 1888, Jones, During, and Hero secretly gave asylum to thousands of fugitive slaves in their stations. In 1888, this led to threats of armed attacks against the mission by coastal slave owners. To avert bloodshed and scandal, the Imperial British East African Company redeemed 1,422 slaves that were being claimed by the owners. But as Samuel Nyanchoga has shown, British officials put pressure on missions not to harbor fugitive slaves. Reverend Jones' continued support to those enslaved came under scrutiny and criticism in his own institution. Jones and the so-called Bombay African freed slaves that he belonged to were faced with discriminatory regulations that led them to petition for an apology in 1881. More research has focused on Protestant missions than on Catholic ones. In the second half of the 19th century, Cardinal Charles Lavigerie founded the religious order of the Missionaries of Africa, also known as White Fathers, who made anti-slavery their primary goal in the last third of the 19th century. In this period, Africa-based White Fathers ransomed enslaved children in large numbers after raids or wars or at slave markets. These children were integrated in the missions. Those who succeeded in their studies received further education in Malta, where they were trained as doctors and catechists, and returned to Africa to work as auxiliaries of European missionaries. Some of these formerly enslaved persons helped thousands of ex-slaves on their journey to freedom by providing healthcare, safety, education, skills training, and encouraging a lifestyle they considered healthy and moral. Joseph Gacci, a Hausa of Kano, and Adrian Atiman, Songhai of Tindirma, were West Africans who had been enslaved as children. They were liberated by the White Fathers and trained as doctors in Malta. They never forgot their West African origins. They were sent as doctor catechists to Tanganyika with the White Fathers caravan of 1888. Gacci, who had been born around 1865 in Kano. You see them here as they grow up in this institution. And here is Atiman and Joseph Gacci with other White Fathers. So Gacci, who sorry, I lost my track, was assigned to the post of Kibanga on Lake Tanganyika, where he worked until the post was suppressed in 1893. In a letter to Lavigerie that he wrote in April 1891, he described the trip he made in the surroundings of Kibanga. He said, "Please allow me to entitle my trip as follows: At the redemption of slaves." Every day, Gacci cured the ill and taught Christian religion and music to orphans who, like him, had been enslaved and liberated. He supported military operations against so-called Arab anti-colonial leaders who had been slave traders and slave owners. Gacci tragically lost his first wife in childbirth when he decided to part from her to cure wounded Belgian Captain Jacques, whom he saw as fighting against slavers. His commitment to the abolitionist cause was unconditional. Adrian Atiman worked in Carema from 1889 until his death in 1956. He was ransomed from slavers by Father Deguerry and wrote to him regularly. And I quote from a letter, "I shall never forget you, very reverend Father, liberator of my body and of my soul." In a letter of New Year wishes to Lavigerie, Atiman wrote, "May the good God let you touch the heart of the civilized world through the mission that the Holy Father, Pope Leo XIII, assigned to you in favor of so many unfortunate slaves who are still in irons, in kangs, naked, abandoned in their final hour. It is not long ago that we saw many slave caravans in this state going to the coast." Gacci, Ataman, and other African liberated slaves were committed abolitionists. But like Crowther in West Africa, their main commitment was to their God, to the enslaved, and to those who cared for the enslaved. Atiman praised the White Sisters' support to African enslaved women. And I quote, "What an immense good have the sisters in Carema done, both to the spiritual and temporal domain. I, deep black with frizzy hair, I tell you that the sisters arrived on time to collect what remained of the slave women and girls around Carema, to turn them into Christians, angels for heaven and family mothers. And now their old masters and mistresses are happy to come to them, and their children are the godchildren of the children of their former slaves, whom they now call their brothers, their sisters, brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law. What I'm telling you are no hyperboles, no turns of phrase. They are the truth. The black woman feels free, feels like a person, not a simple object of trade." End of quote. In spite of their commitment, liberated Africans in various missionary institutions experienced marginalization and humiliation at the hand of those whom they had been disposed to see as liberators. Those alive at the turn of the century witnessed the colonial occupation of Africa. And these are the kind of children, in the hundreds, that every year this kind of liberated Africans accepted looked after and grew with an idea that slavery was wrong. This is the rhizomatic abolitionism that starts a grassroots revolution that I'm talking about. There's very few studies of these persons. They haven't written treatises, except for few of them, but they have an important impact in this history. Some of them, however, like Daniele Sorur Farim Den, born in a Dinka village of present-day South Sudan, enslaved at 13 and redeemed by missionary Daniele Comboni, joined the Comboni order and devoted his life to Christianization, education, and the eradication of slavery in Africa. Daniele Sorur's writings condemn not only African slavery, but also, lucidly and cogently, European racism and its consequences for Africa. This is from his text. This is the original of his manuscript, Le pene dei negri schiavi in Africa. The pain of blacks enslaved in Africa. You can see how it ends with this very sort of strong statement that condemns those who have been privileged in their life, but they haven't shared their privileges with those who didn't have. And he quotes the terrible word, as he says, of Christ our Lord. These persons are profoundly religious. Qui plus accepit, plus requiretur abeo. Those who received most will be expected to give most. The work of these individuals was important, and its importance has been underestimated. These individuals were not acting alone. As Salvatore Ignanto and Felicitas Becker have shown for colonial Tanganyika, their work was part of a broad set of grassroots strategies devised by enslaved persons to enable emancipation through both legal and informal avenues. But these individuals were also integrated in regional and international political processes that were beyond the control of any one person. For example, anti-slavery discourses were instrumental to inter-religious and intra-religious competition over conversions in Africa. Furthermore, they were essential ingredients of the imperialist politics of European and African rulers. African political and intellectual elites participated in the global discourse of modernization of other 19th century empires and applied their own versions of it to their societies. One result of these circumstances was a top-down, state-led abolitionism that must be understood in the context of local processes, hierarchies, and institutions. In the mid-19th century, abolitionism was the discursive arena in which political status was measured at the international level. This engendered a paradoxical situation for some African rulers. On the one hand, alignment with abolitionist positions would grant them recognition in an international order dominated by the main European powers, and particularly Britain, which had made the abolition of the slave trade an axiom in its foreign politics. On the other hand, in most African polities, enslaved persons provided labor vital to their economies. They provided manpower for African armies. They held positions in the state's administrative and ritual apparatus, and were integrated as subordinate members in the families of elites and freeborn. Enslaved women became the wives and concubines of those who could afford acquiring them. Few became the mothers of important men and women. We should not underestimate the humanitarian considerations that influenced African politicians who were morally invested in limiting the negative consequences of the slave trade for their societies. But doing so went against the consolidation of domestic power and their expansionism at the regional level. For some rulers, supporting abolition could turn into an econocide and a political suicide, African rulers. What actually happened varies from place to place. The legal abolition of slavery should be periodized differently for different African regions. For example, on the Mediterranean coasts of North Africa at the beginning of the 19th century, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli had been integrated in the Ottoman Empire for about 300 years. Slaving was rooted in Christian-Muslim rivalry in the Mediterranean. Abolitionism here became fused with an earlier ethics that had been aimed at enforcing reciprocity of treatment of war captives, both Christians and Muslims. In the late 18th and early 19th century, Britain had been signing treaties that required that captured Christians be treated as prisoners of war and not as slaves. If we move toward Eastern Africa and the Indian Ocean in Madagascar, already in the 1817, the King of Imerina signed an abolition treaty with a representative of the British Crown. The wording of these edicts to abolish the slave trade is telling, since it reveals no moral opposition to slavery itself at this early stage. In fact, the emphasis in the Imerina treaties is very much on stopping the slave trade so that these enslaved persons will not be lost to the country, but will be used as workers in the local Imerina economy. So there is no moral opposition to slavery as an institution yet at this stage in this type of legislation. Always in the eastern coast of Africa, we have a series of treaties that were signed by different sultans, and the Sultanate of Zanzibar in particular, which was initially an offshoot of the Arabian governments of Muscat and Oman, became autonomous in 1861, and successive Zanzibari sultans passed laws aimed at abolishing the slave trade and slavery, and Michelle Liebst analyzes these aspects of Zanzibari legal history in detail in her article for the latest issue of the Law and History Review. Egypt abolished slavery only after a period of rampant intensification of slavery under Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali, in 1841, was able to extricate the rule of his house from Ottoman direct control, mobilized enslaved African labor in the army for the building of transport infrastructure and for the development of commercial agriculture on an unprecedented scale in that period. The first Egyptian Khedives to take steps to abolish the slave trade were Khedive Said and Ismail, who passed edicts between the mid-1850s and 1870s. The European legal abolitions that had implications for Africa were actually not far from the first African legal abolitions of slavery. Britain passed a legal abolition of slavery in 1833 and France in 1848. These were the first abolitions when these empires actually had territories in Africa, and therefore these laws were passed and had consequences in terms of emancipating enslaved Africans. But in 1846, so roughly in the same period, the Regency of Tunis abolished the slave trade and slavery. This is something that has been studied extensively by historian Ismail Musa Montana. And Liberia, which at the time was an exceptional fact, it was a republic. The independent Republic of Liberia abolished slavery in its constitution of 1846, the same year. Section 1 states all men are born equally free and independent and have certain natural, inherent, and inalienable rights, amongst which are rights of enjoying and defending life and liberty, of acquiring, possessing, and protecting property, and of pursuing and obtaining safety and happiness. And Section 4, there shall be no slavery within this republic, nor shall any person resident therein deal in slaves, either within or without this republic. Ahmed Bey, the abolition in Tunis, which was formally justified through decrees that were debated extensively from the point of view of Islamic law, because the Bey needed to obtain the support of the local Majlis al-Shari, the Sharia Council for Judicial Ordinances. So these were not simply Western pressure imposing ideas that came from the outside. Whether we're looking at a phenomenon that is growing from the grassroots, or whether we are looking at a phenomenon that is top-down through legal edicts that are more or less hypocritically passed by local rulers, we are nevertheless looking at a history of local institutions, ideas being changed, and new legal concepts having to, whether they liked it or not, they had to negotiate them with the local moral, religious, and political authorities. Some of the most important African states, and I include the Ottoman Empire in the sense that it had a very large amount of territory on the African continent, were actually participated in some of the main conferences that dealt with abolitionism worldwide. The Ottoman Empire participated in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. And a few years later, the Ottoman Empire was one of the 3 non-European co-signatories of the 1890 Brussels Anti-Slavery Act. And the other 2 were the Sultan of Zanzibar and the Persian Shah. By aligning themselves with abolitionist agendas of the main European powers, African rulers obtained financial, technological, and military support. But this was also a step through which they joined other world powers in a discourse that equated abolitionism with civilization. This was a relatively new discourse that was gradually taking shape in their societies, advanced by some groups, resisted by others, on the basis of older normative perceptions of slavery. Some of the most interesting research in this field, driven, for example, by scholars like Takele Merid, Alexander Meckelburg, and Jonas Sachine, all of whom are collaborating in the AFRAB project, so we've worked closely on this research, has been on abolition in Ethiopia, where Menelik II was both an empire builder and a ruler faced with rising European imperialism. Menelik fought expansionist wars that produced slaves. War captives were ideologically assimilated to barbaric outsiders integrated in the higher civilization of the Ethiopian Christian Empire. This expansion was therefore portrayed as civilizing and enslavement as leading to the enslaved's moral improvement. And yet, since his days as king of Shewa, before he became Negus, king of kings, Menelik had been writing letters to rulers in Britain, Italy, and France, in which he supported abolition and expressed his view that as a Christian, he felt solidary with Europe's Christian nations who were spearheading abolitionism in Africa. Jonas Sachine talks of the encounter of 2 ideologies in Ethiopia, one promoted by modernizing pioneers of change, that's Baru Zoide expression, that promoted ending slavery through an intensification of manumissions, and an older one that presented enslavement as potentially civilizing for the enslaved. Everywhere, African politicians and intellectuals reflected critically on slavery. They were concerned both with the improvement of their societies and with rising European imperialism. Michael Odige, alone and with Emmanuel Saboreau, examined the arguments of local activists in the Gold Coast who sought to develop strategies to suppress slavery, but also to counter European policies that were entrenching European economic interests and political expansionism under the excuse of an allegedly God-given mission to suppress slavery in Africa. Eventually, Europe's crusade was a rationale used to legitimize Europe's occupation of Africa. These dynamics did not have consequences only for centralized African polities. Harris Memel Foté's L'esclavage dans les sociétés lignagères de la forêt ivoirienne shows that slavery in lineage-based societies existed and was not imposed from the outside, but was a social practice required and sustained by internal necessities. Like Ashine for Ethiopia, Memel Foté emphasizes the paternalist ideologies that supported the reproduction of slavery and of hierarchies rooted in slavery. Yet as a Marxist theorist, Memel Foté denounces paternalism, and I quote, as an element in the strategy of domination, in the peculiar structure of this domination, where the master behaves in ways that mask, maintain, and sustain the initial inequality. Now, what is very special about Memel Foté in the African historiography of anti-slavery and of this period more generally, is that he's actually able to criticize some of the leaders of anti-colonial independence, which is a very sensitive issue for historians of Africa. He not criticizes them in a sense of speaking sort of negatively about their work, but thinking critically about what they did. And so he reflects on Kwame Nkrumah's thought and writing and shows that lineage ideology as an ideology of the negation of inequalities in past communalist society and as an ideology of the refusal of class struggle in colonial and neo-colonial society was a necessary and effective means of rallying around the Convention People's Party and its leader, the natural allies of Nkrumah. So Memel Fote here is highlighting the fact that someone like Kwame Nkrumah, by idealizing the alleged communalism and egalitarianism of a pre-colonial African society, is actually then able to entrench the control of a social class that he belongs to and that was supported by that type of hegemony. He's not criticizing the stratification that existed in that society in which there were enslaved and enslavers. This specific dynamics varied from African regime to regime. Sékou Touré in Guinea, for example, behaves very differently. We must be wary of generalizations, but African historians are developing important critical studies of the resilience and legacies of slavery in the post-colonial period. And so we find that Umaru Musa, for example, who's been working on Niger, is reflecting on how the leaders of anti-colonial independence did a similar thing. They opposed this idealized egalitarianism of African society to colonial domination, for which the metaphor of slavery is used consistently. But in doing so, they shielded the African elites that they belonged to from critiques by the lower classes who had continued to experience marginalization because they were of slave descent. Ibrahim Antioub, doyen of the School of History of Dakar, has documented the limited critical engagement with interior slavery not only of national politicians, but also of nationalist historiographies. And Abderrahman Ngaide wrote an introspective analysis in which he's actually talking about his own difficult position as a historian who is also always positioned vis-a-vis the persons he conducts research amongst as either a descendant of a slave owner or a descendant of persons who were enslaved. So these struggles never ceased being political. We're back to Walter Rodney, if you want. But the apparent simplicity of this conclusion would be misleading if it were taken to say that all the formerly enslaved were always everywhere actual or potential radical abolitionists, while elites defended the hierarchies that underpin their privileges. It's not as simple as that. And if you look closely at the best historiographies and the ones that are looking at sources very carefully, you find that indeed there are contexts where persons who came from slavery actually defended the type, or once they took power, defended the type of expansionism and imperialism, rather than using, if you want, the abolitionist argument to argue that it was finally their turn to be in power. A particularly interesting, if unique case study is the case of the kingdom of Fuladu in what is today in Senegambia. The kingdom of Fuladu was a Fulani kingdom in which a revolt of persons of slave status and classificatory slaves started a revolt against those in power and seized power themselves. But as they seized power, they reproduced the types of slaving activities that they had been targets of in previous generations. And I quote Abderrahman Ngaide. In Fuladu, in addition to his liberation, the slave now accesses power with all the prerogatives and all the honors linked to it. War becomes a profession and a means of enrichment, and at the same time of emancipation or even social reclassification. The country lives to the rhythm of military expeditions. From these operations, prisoners are brought back who become slaves. The slave makes slaves. He frees himself and becomes a master in two ways, by enslaving and by ruling the country at the expense of the Rimbe, the nobles. What sense to make of all this? On the one hand, some groups are engaged with abolitionist ideas that had an Atlantic genealogy and had been co-developed with liberated Africans who had experienced or whose forebears had experienced Atlantic slavery. On the other hand, there are old ethics of slavery in which ameliorationist approaches prevailed. The paternalist and ameliorationist ethics of slavery was carried by many who led also the anti-colonial resistance. The fact that radical abolitionism was associated with the installation of racist and brutal European imperialism hampered or delayed the evolution of internal anti-slavery movements in Africa. Now, associating abolitionism with European imperialism was both right and wrong. It was wrong in the sense that radical anti-slavery had a long pluralist genealogy which formerly enslaved Africans had contributed to. Global abolitionism had evolved in the long term as a reaction against the scale and intensity of dehumanization of the transatlantic slave trade before it started serving the interests of European imperialists. But of course, the perception of abolitionism as corrupt or at least suspicious because owned by European imperialists was also right, because in the last third of the 19th century, European imperialism advanced under the banner of abolitionism and justified violence in the name of abolitionism. In the late 19th century, the monarchies of Europe arrogated to themselves the mission to save African slaves. The self-designated abolitionists were imperialists. Leopold II of Belgium committed atrocities in Africa, but was perceived by many as a leading abolitionist. Another paradox in this history is that anti-colonial resistance, while denouncing colonialism as slavery, was often driven by African elites who descended from former slave owners. And about 60 years later, decolonization was led by nationalists who idealized a supposedly egalitarian traditional African communalism that never was. Now, in the last few minutes, I started a bit late, so I need a few more minutes before I can let you go. And in the last few minutes that I have, I want to talk about the most recent developments of this paradoxical and often contradictory history that we need to understand better if we want to understand abolitionism at a global level, because the continent of Africa is a very large part of the world and therefore of this history. And it's a very little known and little studied history. I hope you realize this. But in the time that remains, I want to sort of focus on the Central Sahel, the region that I know particularly well, which had been studied very extensively. Slavery in the Sokoto Caliphate and the surrounding regions has been studied extensively, partly because there is a real abundance of sources. Sources written by the leaders of the Sokoto jihads, who were a network of scholars and political elites who could write in Arabic or in Hausa and Kanuri Ajami. And they wrote extensively, so we're familiar with their point of view. And historians have used this to do in-depth analysis of their ethics of slavery. We know, for example, that the leaders of the Sokoto Jihad opposed Atlantic slavery and even signed treaties with Britain to make sure that Muslims would not be sold to Christians through the Atlantic, across the Atlantic slave trade. But these were also societies that were major slave societies. If these ideologies and these thoughts, ideas of slavery and ideas about abolitions are well known for the elites, what do we know about the rank and file? Are there sources of social history that can tell us how, in general, popular culture changed and the notion of slavery as a legitimate institution, that pious persons could be slave owners, could be slave traders, and be respected in their society? Is there a change, a cultural change, and when does it happen? And when does it happen in society as a whole? And this is some of the work that we're trying to do in the Langue Archive project with Camille Lefebvre and a series and other linguists of Kanuri and Hausa languages. We have been looking for a variety of sources that have been collected by European linguists who were studying the language, the Kanuri or the Hausa language. So we're not so interested in anything specific there. We're just collecting specimens of Hausa. And the specimens of Hausa are often forms of popular culture. They are work songs. They are songs in honor of slave dignitaries and reveal a world, and they are biographies of persons who are interviewed and asked, tell me a story or tell me the story of your life. And this gives us a glimpse in a number of phenomena. For one, for example, the fact that slave was not one status but many. There was a hierarchy within the status of slave, that meant that social mobility was possible both within slavery, and slavery was highly absorptionist, therefore enslaved persons could and were integrated through manumission in the society of the free. And this worked as a form of social control. In these societies, it meant that those enslaved were more likely, a little more likely to invest in the reproduction of an institution and try to acquire social mobility within it than to take a radical stance against it. A radical stance that in the interior of West Africa, they hadn't really come into extensive contact with. You didn't have the kind of rhizomic, liberated African abolitionists in large presence. So we have songs that exalt, for example, a slave dignitary who captures many slaves and redistributes them to his ruler and to his dependents. This is a late 19th century song, and it really does in honor of war captain Cascella Mandangelma, and it doesn't show a sense that being an enslaved person was either a source of shame for high-ranking slaves or something that you shouldn't engage with. We have sources, autobiographies of people who lived in rural households who talk of a close integration of enslaved persons in these societies. And we have autobiographies of men who had been enslaved, were manumitted, and who talk about their relation with their owners as a relation where their owners admired them so much that, in fact, when they manumitted them, they tried to ask them to stay with them and would have even shared the inheritance with them and their children if they had remained. But these were situations that were possible. They don't mean that slavery was benign. We also have work songs of a woman, well, the woman is the singer, but she sings as an enslaved woman who misses her lover, who was a slave like her, but who was sold into the trans-Saharan slave trade. The song, the lament for the handsome Mamadou, goes, "Oh yeah, life is a game of chance, my Mamadou. Mamadou is gone, disappeared from the world, my Mamadou. The neck that once wore a garment is now covered in chains. Mamadou of Haido, my Mamadou. Someone who once slept in a carpet now sleeps on the floor. Mamadou, the world has shown its character. The hand once adorned with henna is now tied with ropes. Life is a game of chance. The leg which wore pants is now bound with a shackle. Mamadou, the world has shown its character. The mouth that once ate kola nuts is full of sand. Mamadou, son of Haido, my Mamadou. The eye that was once oiled with coal is full of sand." You can see the pain of slavery. This woman loses someone who was a slave like her to the and is sold in the transatlantic as a trans-Saharan, as a punishment. And she expresses her grief in a song that would have been sung again and again by persons who were working and was collected in the late 19th century and transcribed by a linguist, Rudolf Pritze, who was studying the language. We also have, however, some proof of the presence of these rhizomatic abolitionists. And Thomas Cole John, who was working with Samuel Crowther in Lokoja, transmitted a description that he collected in Hausa, known as Labarin Samare. And the Labarin Samame is a story of the expedition to take slaves. It's a close description of how people who wanted to enslave groups and sell them would go on these expeditions and capture others. And at the end, it says, there's a commentary, a moral commentary, saying this is what spoils our society today. So you do see that there's a pain of enslavement, there's a resentment for it. You do have a process of abolition that starts under colonial rule, and that is never really accomplished. You have NGOs and groups in the civil society that form and support a social movement that starts at the grassroots of people getting together and criticizing a class of politicians that have not been representing them. These are very recent phenomena. These are phenomena of the 1990s, but they are still ongoing today. You have these are initially phenomena led by men of groups like Ilgilas Veila or Ali Bouzou or Aga Al-Hat, who start forming these associations. But recently there have been women activists who come from slavery and who follow in the example of women like Khadijatu Mani. They started rejecting a past and a history that they do not want to live with anymore. So I'm just want to tell you about Al-Husna, who worked with Adijatu. When she freed herself after having been enslaved, she protected and hosted a number of women who were in the same situation, just gave them asylum, basically, in her village and looked after her. And in her autobiography, which she gave in a documentary that we produced together with Absatu Bagaya and Timidria, she expresses her experience of enslavement. She shows how she hosted and protected many women who ran away after she herself was able to leave slavery behind. She describes with rural metaphors her experience. She was sold like a goat. She was treated like an insect that falls in a cup of milk that you throw away in disgust. She had fought against the harassment of owners, and she couldn't rely on the shielding power of the law, but she was like a hen that chases roosters away with her wings. She described her efforts to support others like her as the work of a dove who collected worms to feed the nest that she protected. She is also a member of Timidria, and Timidria is integrated in a network of West African abolitionist NGOs like Timidria from Mauritania, Mali, Chad, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Ali Bouzou, current president of Timidria, who coordinated with me both phases of the AHRC-funded Lesland project, has been lobbying the government, which he wants to have as an ally on his side in the fight against the legacies of slavery. And Biramda Abid, president of Iran Mauritania, has been running presidential campaigns on an abolitionist agenda. And he sees his political struggle as an internal class struggle that the first generation of African post-colonial presidents did not carry out and that his generations inherited. All of this confirms Frederick Douglass' dictum that I cited earlier, that power concedes nothing without a demand, that it never did and it never will. This demand has an international history and it has an African history. Its African history has always contributed to shaping its global history. And its African history should increasingly inform the historiography of global slavery and abolition. Thank you.